the vestments. So section 5, vestments. We didn't do that yesterday. Give the page number. I'd give you a page number, but it might vary from place to place. So, this is the origin of vestments. This is all according to Cardinal Lambertini, who was Benedict XIV. But well, the authors pretty much agree with this stuff. It is most probable that the apostles did not use street clothing for Mass, but rather used vestments destined only for sacred use. There's a whole, we don't know. But don't forget that in the Jewish rites, the vestments were very, very elaborate. So it would seem impossible that they would not continue that idea. So it is true that the alb and the chasuble would have been used in a domestic setting or on the street. See, remember the alb was like a tunic, what you see our Lord in Sacred Heart statues. And the chasuble, a big cloak, would have been used in a domestic setting or on the street, but a different form of these garments were most probably used for Mass. But we really don't know. The case in point is that should be Pope Pope Paul V, 1660s. Paul V, early 1700s. No, early 1600s. He's the one that has his name all over the front of St. Peter's Basilica. Early 1600s. Borghesius. He was the one Borghese Pope. The Borgheses were a big family in Rome. Molto ricco. All right? And the idea was one of my nephews has to be on the throne, and he got on the throne. And one of the things he did was permitted priests to cover their heads during Mass in China, where an uncovered head was considered improper, provided, however, that the head covering be of a distinctive style to be used only in the sacred liturgy. See, so that's a point where something that was used commonly was transferred to the liturgy, but had to be in a distinctive style. So that's the point there. Thomasinus, he's a Thomist, French Thomist, Thomasin, author, 1700s, teaches that the tunic, dalmatic, and chasuble were at one time used by laypersons, but with time became used only by clerics. Thomasinus cites the life of Saint Caesarius for his information. The Amos, in the ancient liturgical books, it is called Anaboladium. Its original purpose, it seems, was to cover the neck, since up to the 8th century, both lay people and clergy had a bare neck. They didn't wear neckties or collars. And this seemed inappropriate to see a bare neck. So there was a neck covering. Something that it represents the ancient Jewish ephod worn by the priests of the Old Testament. So they wore a square thing here. You see that in some engravings and paintings and all, with jewels on it. 12 tribes of Israel, the ephod. I think that's far-fetched, because it doesn't look anything like an ephod. The ephod was worn here. This is worn up here. So anyway, the albs, clerics commonly wore the alb in ancient times outside of the Mass, just as in Dalmatia, the common clothing was the dalmatic, from which the name comes. See, so their common clothing was called the dalmatic. That's what they wore in Dalmatia, which is Yugoslavia area. Like other pieces of clothing, however, these assumed a purely ecclesiastical use. The alb was even used by those in minor orders. Altar servers in the Dominican Mass still use them. So the Novus Ordo has taken that over. I think they put their altar boys in albs now. Little albs. Gradually, the surplice replaced the alb in the minor orders and in the Roman Rite. So there's this development and evolution. The maniple is not as old as the other vestments. There is no mention of it in the Fathers. Its origin seems to be that of a handkerchief used by the priests in the early centuries. It seems that other clerics at the altar made use of it. It seemed, again, to become a symbol of rank for deacons at the time of St. Gregory the Great. Cardinal Bona says that it became an actual vestment adorned like the others in the 10th century. But nothing is certain as to when it became a vestment. The priest takes the maniple before the stole. The bishop, however, takes it after the confiteor at the altar. This was originally the custom of the priests as well. You see, the Pontifical Mass holds a lot of the previous customs, the older customs. It was the custom in the past that the chasuble would cover the whole body down to the feet and would be rolled up to the sleeves during the confiteor. The original stola was a long garment which covered the whole body. The word stole comes from a decorative galloon on the bottom of the garment, which galloon was called a stola. It means what? What's a galloon? It's the gold things that you see on vestments. It's a galloon, gallone in Italian. Banding. The chasuble. The old chasuble covered the priest from the neck to the feet and completely covered his arms and hands. So it was a big thing. It was like a blanket, like a tremendous poncho. For this reason, it was necessary to lift the chasuble on both sides. Because the chasuble was so big, it should be so big and heavy, there began the custom of lifting the chasuble at the elevation. The deacon and subdeacon on penitential days wear folded chasubles for the reason that their functioning required that the large chasuble be folded. It was because of the mud during the processions. There were processions on the penitential days, and because they would walk in the streets, particularly in Lent during the springtime, they would get all muddy, so they folded them up. That's the origin of that. The chasuble, before it had a sacred use, was commonly worn by lay people. This is certain from many testimonies. They would wear it on journeys and even in the city as a mourning dress. Now, mourning, for non-English speakers, mourning means that you feel bad because somebody died. It's pronounced the same way. This is matutina. This is. All right. So when people died, they don't do it anymore. But when, say, typically if a widow lost her husband, she would wear black for a long time. Completely black. It's the only thing she ever wore was black. For a certain amount of time. Queen Victoria, after Prince Albert died, wore black for the rest of her life. Mourning Prince Albert. So people went into mourning clothing for a long time when somebody died. Black. See, so that was one of the now people don't do it anymore. Everyone pops off to heaven. Have a big party. Making spaghetti in heaven. I wonder who produces the spaghetti. I don't know how they grow the spaghetti. The liturgical colors. The colors began to be used at the beginning of the 3rd century. Up to that time, only white was used. Makes life easier for the sacristan. The Greeks, up to the 13th century, used only white and red. In the West, Innocent III, early 1200s, attests that there were only 4 colors: white for confessors and virgins, red for apostles and martyrs, and black on days of fast, and in masses for the dead. So they wore black during Lent. During Advent and from Septuagesima until Holy Saturday. So black was used a lot. Green was used on ferial days. He does not mention violet. That was a later thing. The first mention of violet was under Urban V, toward the end of the 1300s, who used them during Lent. Yes?
Just my question is interesting to note that during the pontificate of Pope Pius XII, he began to suppress some stuff of the chasuble, and then in the Noble Order we can find the total suppression of the maniple. So why is that? Why did you do that, like suppression?
Well, they would say, you see, a lot of priests don't like the maniple because, and it's true, it does get in your way a little bit. Like, for example, if you have to use your left hand to take something out of the tabernacle, you have to very much watch the maniple. So I think because it didn't have a specific use, and because a lot of priests didn't like the maniple, they just suppressed the maniple. The folded chasuble, that is an ancient thing again. Why? They're going back to the early church. Why are you suppressing the folded chasuble? They might say, well, it was only because of the mud and there's no more mud, or, it no longer has a purpose. They might say that, and that's true. It doesn't really apply now, but it certainly made you realize that it was a penitential season, though. That's the worst thing they did, we wouldn't be complaining. You could make an argument for those things. Some authors claim that purple was used in Rome before the 13th century. Beretta comes from birum, which does not mean beer in Latin, but simply means the covering of the head. The beretta was not used in Rome and elsewhere in the 9th century. The amice was used to cover the head. Just like the Dominicans do, I think the Franciscans, they don't use. Lebrun, he's a very well-known author on the Mass, mentions that in the winter in Paris, the priest would have his head covered up to the secrets inclusive. That he would wear the beretta in the first part of the Mass, up to the secrets. It gets cold in Paris during the winter, and they didn't have central heating and whatnot in the Middle Ages. So I imagine it was rather cool. And in those stone churches, it gets really cold. So, but they did not use the amice. That's what he says. With the passage of time, however, the head covering became what it is today. Either the four-cornered hat, Poland and Spain, they get 4, and the three-cornered variety everywhere else. Finally, it cannot be said that Christ. Forget that. I think we're done with that. Okay. We did symbolic meaning of the vestments. Now we're on liturgical language. Back to liturgical language. Said that. All right. So we're in this, I should bring in the book to show it to you, it's very interesting. This Franciscan who wrote this book in 1670, this is page 29. Everyone have page 29? We were quoting him, and we did the first paragraph. So, moreover, the Mass is a peculiar office belonging to the priest, insomuch that no lay or clergyman, that is, no priest, dares to undergo it. Now, this is 17th century English, and I had to massage this a little bit to make it more understandable. Not to be done, but in churches. So that means only in churches, necessity accepted, nor without vestments proper only to them. The laity were not to enter into the chancel, that means the sanctuary, nor to meddle with anything that belonged to the sacrifice. Only those who, by virtue of their particular sacramental orders, were permitted, they answered the priest in the Mass. So he's reaffirming the sacerdotal quality of the Mass. Notice he doesn't say that people are responding from the pews. It suffices that the faithful be present with devotion. This is the same priest writing this. As they believe what they do not see, so they offer up their vows and prayers. Vows means their devotions, their resolutions, you might say. It's not vow in a strict sense. In union of the priest's action, oblation means offering, and prayer. For they come not hither to that place, only to make their private prayers, but to offer their hearts and souls with the priests in this sacrifice. What we have been saying. Which they may do, although they neither hear nor understand the words which the priest reads. And the simple and ignorant people many times better than the learned clergy. That's what he says. In other words, that the simple people might understand the nature of the Mass better than the learned clergy. That's the idea. And they might be more devout than the learned clergy. So that's my point is that the essential participation in the Mass is an interior thing. Just as the essential aspect of martyrdom is the interior oblation. It has nothing to do with the blood and the gore or the torture or anything. It's the oblation that is the key to it, because you could be dragged into martyrdom if you say, this part of martyrdom is offering yourself to be killed. It's part of it. That's the essential part of it. If you're dragged, you don't get called a martyr, because the essential thing is the oblation, the interior oblation. So in the sacrifice of the Mass, the essential participation is the interior oblation. Yes.
When it says they answered the priest, how is that?
Meaning the Ecum Spiritus.
So they did it.
Well, no. The people, only those in virtue of their particular sacramental orders were permitted. They answered the priest in the Mass.
Okay, so those...
If they were people in the sanctuary, saying that people don't go into the sanctuary. No, the dialogue Mass has no history whatsoever. The only mention of people answering would be that exists before the dialogue Mass is that if there's a lack of servers, the people who are standing around, adstantes, or present, could answer. That's it. But it's not as if the whole congregation is stating these responses. There's no history for it. Even they admit that. There's no history. See, the low Mass is low, obviously. Sounds like Kamala Harris. The low mass is a mass that's low. You see, it was a monastery mass. It didn't exist in ancient times because you had high masses. The mass was done solemnly. And so the idea of dressing up the low mass with something, with answering in the congregation and making it some sort of something that is quasi-solemn has no history at all. It's just a low mass. You see, it's a private kind of mass. But it became, with time, the standard mass that people saw. And that's unfortunate because, yes, it is, you could argue that there's no music, that it's the priest at the altar, they see him do things at the altar, then they go home. And that is not, Urban the VIII, see, it used to be, I think I told you, that you had to go to the low mass in the morning on Sundays, receive communion if you were receiving, and then come back for the high mass later on. You could not fulfill your Sunday obligation unless you also went to the high mass. And you see, that would have made the people more liturgically conscious. And yes, it's true that they can join in the singing if they have any kind of decent voice. Most of the time they sound horrible. But it would not be, the choir simply, it doesn't matter if the whole church is singing or if only the choir is singing. It doesn't matter. There's no objection to that, or there's no, that's fine. That's a participation that they can have. But I think if they had maintained that, then the low mass would not have effectively replaced the high mass, which became something that was unusual. And only once a Sunday you saw a high mass, and that was only for maybe 10 or 20% of the people that would like to go to it. Most of the time, people went to the low mass. And of course, the low mass didn't take as long as the high mass. So that's better because then you can get out faster and then get home and eat breakfast and start watching the ball game. Because, the ball game is the most important thing or football games or something like that. Or you do some recreational thing, see. And then Sunday became, the Mass became something that you got over with early. So that was one of the bad things before the council, is that the low Mass was so prevalent. And so it was dry, you see, the priest, and also, of course, these huge parishes in which they had to say Mass in 1 hour. So the sermon lasted maximum 10 minutes. And then back to the altar, and the priest would have to say Mass real fast, or else the next priest is waiting in the sacristy to come out. In my parish in New York City, there was 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 upstairs. And downstairs there were 4 more Masses. See, so there was this kind of production, mode, you might say. Things had to move. And so priests used to say Mass very quickly. They lost interest. It was just rote. And so when the new changes came in, the Mass is a lot shorter now. This is a lot easier. We can get out faster. See, the priests liked it better. See, that's the way it was spoon-fed. See, much faster. You can say the new Mass in about 10 minutes, I think. If you use the right stuff. So that was, so they had a kind of rote aspect or attitude toward the Mass, and as I told you, instead of making the signs of the cross like this, they would do this over the chalice to get through the Mass faster. And they would. Yeah.
So, did part of the spoon feeding come by saying that all you had to do was attend the low Mass?
No, that was Urban the VIII. That was 1630s.
Okay.
He's the one that relaxed that. But before that, you had to go to both Masses.
And then, so the spoon feeding came with Vatican II?
Vatican II, the idea of making them, first of all, putting the Mass in English, so then people can understand it. Well, that's nice that the people, how could you object to that the people could understand the Mass? And that will make the liturgy simpler, and that it won't take as much time to say it, all of these things. and we're going back to the early church. That I remember all of this as a teenager, and all of this stuff, and so things that you could not really object to. How could you object to going back to the early church? When you're a lay person, you don't understand what that means. And in fact, they did not go back to the early church. They were very selective about certain things. So that's the way they did it. They're changing the Mass into English. I didn't like it, but I mean, a lot of people did. I knew there was something wrong. So, that was when I was 14 years old, which was a long, long time ago. So, almost 50 years ago. So anyway, so that's the point. Next paragraph. The understanding of words little avails unless the affection of the will second it. That means support it. The words serve but to move the senses, and by them the understanding. If then the understanding be well informed and instructed, as all good Christians are or ought to be in the knowledge of the mysteries, nothing is more required but a correspondence of the will to that dictamen. In other words, that they know what's going on, they assent to it, they offer up their own devotion together with the sacrifice of the Mass. So it is not necessary that they understand the Mass. As a matter of fact, you can see from this course that there is a lot to understand about it. We come not to Mass to be instructed, for that, as I said, even now, it is to have been supposed to have been in sermons. That's what he said. This is English. Catechisms or otherwise, but we come to offer up our hearts and souls with a confident belief of the whole mystery, and assurance of the participation and communication in all the benefits, fruits, and benedictions which follows the devout hearing thereof. See, so that's why the Council of Trent said that the Mass and the liturgy should be explained to the people, because, as I said, reading the Missal, you're not going to understand what's going on in the Mass just from reading the Missal. You're not going to understand all of what St. Paul is saying or what the Old Testament is saying unless somebody explains it to you. So that's why it was the Council of Baltimore insisted that the Epistle and Gospel of the Mass, Sundays and Holy Days, be read in English, or the vernacular, to the people. That was not done in Europe. See, so, and it should have been done, because the idea is that you read it and then, to a certain extent, not necessarily, but you comment on it, something that's always in the Epistle or Gospel you can comment on. See, and explain the Epistle and the Gospel. But you could have, actually, you got a syllabus from the bishop as to what to preach about, meaning a list of subjects. See, but and that was done before hand missals were common. See, Council of Baltimore is early 1800s. People didn't have hand missals; that didn't exist. And it's also true that a lot of people, especially at that time, may not have been able to read. Yes.
So, Your Excellency, before Vatican II was common that the ordinary will say to all the parish priests what to preach that Sunday?
It was common, and it was not necessarily the case. But don't forget that the bishop is the preacher of the diocese, and the priests must carry out what he wants to preach about. And he would give them points to make. Otherwise, you never know what some priest is going to get up and say. You just never know. When you have my diocese, when I was growing up, there were 700 priests. You don't know what 700 people are going to do, so that there was a certain control. That was diocesan only. There were religious priests too. all which may be done, although we neither know nor understand the words. And if anyone will trust to experience, let him go to Catholic assemblies. And I love this quote. And he shall plainly see that as Pater Noster did build the churches, and our Father did pull them down, so the devotion of the Catholic people in their Latin Mass will, in all respects, surpass that of those who frequent the invented vulgar service. Oh. You couldn't get a better description of the new Mass than the invented vulgar service. The beauty of it is that vulgar has changed in meaning. See, vulgar here simply means vernacular, but it has changed in meaning. Now it means, how would you say, vulgar, like bad words or vulgar language. You know, it means something very low and disgusting and really horrid. Vulgar. See, so it's perfect, the invented vulgar service. That's what it really should be called. I love that quote. And that with a great deal of reason, so the idea is our Father, that means the Anglicans saying everything in the vernacular. That has brought the churches down, which is true. Today, and that with a great deal of reason, for that they serve God in a more noble way, to wit, in a sacrifice instituted by Christ Jesus, meaning Catholics. Moreover, we may consider that as there is one Lord, one faith, one baptism, so there is one church, which, well, he doesn't capitalize. Some things he capitalizes, some things he doesn't. Inasmuch as may be, speaks in one tongue, that as our hearts are united in the same faith and our devotions to the same sacrifice, so also we may agree in those tongues which are not subject to alteration and changes, as the vulgar languages are, in so much that if anyone should read the divine service, as they call it in English, referring to the Anglicans, as it was 100 years ago, he would rather cause laughter than devotion. In other words, the English of, he's writing in 1670, the English of 1570 was so different that if they were to have their Anglican service in the 1570 English, the people would laugh rather than be devout. That's how much, and it did change a lot. It did. I'll bring in the Douay-Rheims version to show you how much it changed. That was done in the 1580s. The original Douay-Rheims. And as it is now, there may be many new coined words, that's for sure, which the vulgar as little understand as the Latin itself, the vulgar meaning the common people. It comes from vulgo in Latin, which means the crowd. And but see, that's proof that words change. You see, if you said that in English, you know, the vulgar people, a terrible insult in modern English. You're a member of the vulgar, all right? As if the Latin itself, and if any but English are present, their understanding is barren as it was before. So, therefore, if French come over to England or Dutch or something, they can't understand it. Now, on the contrary, in all places and countries, the Mass is the same, and all of what nation soever equally know what the Mass means and what they are to do thereat, and know each part thereof, and how to apply their devotion. We may also note that the priests, who only have power to celebrate the Mass, of what nation soever he be, or wheresoever he is, may perform this action so to the satisfaction of the hearers. In other words, an English priest can go to Rome and say the Mass, he can go to France and say the Mass, he can go to Germany, Spain, etc., say the same Mass, which we do now. So it's an attestation to the unity of the faith and of the church. It's the living language of an unchanging church. That's what Latin is. So even the Chinese had the Latin Mass. You could go to China, Japan had the Latin Mass. The Russians had the Latin Mass. Because the Tsar would not permit the Russians to have an Eastern rite. He tolerated the Catholics to a certain extent. But they had to use Latin. It had to be the Latin Mass. And they took all of their ecclesiastical culture, you might say, from Poland. So they had the four crowns on the beretta, on the beretta, just like the Polish. Everything came from Poland because Poland was part of the Russian Empire. So there was a seminary in St. Petersburg, Catholic seminary in St. Petersburg before the revolution. And when the revolution came, the early revolution, the Kerensky, the Catholics were all happy because then they could have their Corpus Christi processions out in the street. And they thought, well, this is great because now we have some freedom of religion. Whereas the Tsar was always, so it was just merely tolerated, Catholicism in Russia, under the Tsars. Catherine the Great, she got the Jesuits in, but because she liked the way they taught school. But the Tsar was the head of the church in Russia. So the idea of another Christian religion particularly was something that was a threat. It would not regard him as the head of the church. And that was even Tsar Nicholas II. So summary of why the church uses Latin in her liturgy. This is a summary of everybody who talks about it. One, as a general rule, that language is used in the liturgy in which the gospel was preached, as a general rule. This is also true of the Jews and the Muslims who use ancient Hebrew and classical Arabic, respectively, in their services, tongues unknown to the people. So even to this day, the boys receiving bar mitzvah have to memorize and recite at least a certain amount of Psalm 118, which praises the law. They have to say that in Hebrew. To this day. And the Greek Orthodox, to a greater or lesser extent, will use the classical Greek. But in this country, it's mostly English. But it used to be that they never used their vernacular if they were doing Greek. The use of a dead language used only by the Catholic Church preserves the meaning or words from change and corruption. See, so you can read St. Thomas, which is written 800 years or so ago, and all those words have the same meaning as they do today in scholastic, ecclesiastical meaning. They're all the same. You can read St. Ambrose, St. Augustine. It's all the same. And you see that's very important for the church in order to preserve her doctrines, because, as we know, words change. Vulgar, for example, or awful, the most awful part of the Mass. Third, it serves the unity of the church. As he said, in other words, there's one language. Language is a very important way to establish unity. That's why countries would insist on a single language. For example, Ukraine was insisting in the Donbass region that people abandon their Russian and learn Ukrainian and speak only Ukrainian. That always breeds trouble when you do that. And it did. They go too far, too fast. When the Germans went into Czechoslovakia, they insisted that nobody in the Sudetenland, they had to all speak German. People don't like to give up. Imagine if somebody came in and said, you have to speak Russian. Well, you don't want to speak Russian. Believe me, you don't want to speak Russian. hard. See, so a unity of language is something that keeps a country together. And so it serves the purpose of the church very nicely. It makes it possible for priests to celebrate Mass everywhere. It is a sacred language used only for the sacred liturgy, ecclesiastical documents, and sacred theology. So it's not the language of the street. In a sense, it's the language of God and of heaven, in a way. It's a language preserved for sacred things and reserved for sacred things. It is the language of Rome, thereby reinforcing the unity of the church under the Roman pontiff. And Latin has a special majesty which other languages do not have.
What is that majesty?
The very frequent use of M and N. Dominus. See? That hum that Latin has. Yes.
I remember Bishop Fliss mentioned in the past that it's more probable that our first fathers spoke Hebrew.
Who was our first fathers?
Adam and Eve.
Well, they weren't. That was male and female. They weren't our first fathers.
sorry. In English, in Spanish, is fathers. Sorry,
first parents.
Sorry, parents.
Yeah. We don't want to have gender problems here or anything.
Sorry, it's the language thing.
Would you say our padres for that?
Yes,
you would.
Yeah, we say padres. Yes.
Ah, okay. Well, it's parents.
Yes, sorry.
That's a theory. We don't know.
Yes, but in that case, if nowadays Latin will be higher than Hebrew in that sense, even though Hebrew was the language of the Old Testament people of God.
Higher? I mean, I don't think you could put a level on it. Hebrew is certainly incapable of speaking in theological terms. It is a poetic language very attached to analogies based on material things. At least in its, Old Testament state. Now they speak Hebrew in Israel now. They may have manufactured many words, but Greek is the abstract language. See, the Greeks brought in the notion of a whole sorts of abstract words, and that was transferred to Latin too. I mean, a lot of abstract words. And you need abstract words in sacred theology and the Mass. So. You do. So it never would have served well.
Could you explain further how it is that the use of M, I can't remember what the other sound you said, how does that convey,
N and M.
How does that convey
Because it's a rumble. See, it's majesty and power.
So it's, I'm trying to understand, so there's something psychological about it for us, because there's a...
Well, if you hear and then you hear boop, 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 boop. Right? Don't you hear something majestic about and it's also it's beat. You see, it's true.
So it would be because of
see the poetic the accent is on the antipino. Bum 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 bum. In English it's ba boop ba boop ba boop ba boop ba boop. That's Shakespeare. To be or not to be. You see? It doesn't have the same majesty.
Yes. It's just curious because they say that that's something pagan, but it's why some people like the strange throat singing of the Mongolians, because it's very rumbly.
How do we get to Mongolia from Rome?
Well, it's the fact that I was trying to understand how it is that this sound conveys majesty, and it seems to.
Well, I just explained it to you.
Yes, that's
yeah.
that's why.
Right.
Yes.
Right. In other words, a drum is going to be much more majestic
yes.
and speak power than a piccolo. Right?
Of course.
Well, modern languages tend to be like piccolos. Right? There was no language that ever came close to Latin for majesty, really. Even Greek, it's terrible.
That's really fascinating.
Yes. All right. And answer your question. So, now we should, on page 31, this beginning of Mass. I think that's where we are. Right? Okay. All right, the sign of the cross, the very first thing the priest does is to sign himself. And as I mentioned, you don't do that in the new Mass. The sign of the cross is very ancient. Tertullian said, at every step in coming in and in going out, Tertullian is around 200 AD, putting on our garments and shoes, when washing, when at table, when lighting a candle, when going to bed, when sitting down, at every work we perform, we Christians mark the forehead with the sign of the cross. It's early church. They didn't bring that back. It is clearly appropriate, therefore, that the church begin her central act of worship with the sign of a cross. By contrast, the new Mass does not. So it says he says good morning. Or some other stupid thing. The Judicame, this is a psalm of David when absent from his country in order to avoid Saul. Some say to avoid Absalom. Some of the psalms are to avoid Saul. The other psalms are to avoid Absalom. They have more or less the same theme of fleeing from some enemy. That's why you get that theme a lot in the psalms. My enemies are surrounding me, and so that's so anyway, that's what we'll stop.